Okay, so we're going to be learning some basics of watercolor, and the first thing that we're going to be starting out with is getting our paper ready. Now, watercolor paper is really thick. It's like a sponge. You can see how thick it is, and it's designed to hold water just like a sponge. And so one of the things we want to be careful about doing is not sticking our fingers all over the middle of it. Anytime you're handling watercolor paper, you want to try and just touch it by the edges and handle it as little as possible. Okay, so you're going to divide your paper on one side into two sections, and you're going to label it. So one side is just going to say wash. The other side is going to say wash with color gradient. So this one's going to be one color, and this one's going to be two different colors. Okay, now on the other side, you're going to divide it into 8 even sections. I like to use a ruler so that everything looks nice and tidy, and you're going to label each of these. So go ahead and stop the video after I go through these so that you can pause it and label everything. So the first one is going to say glazing, Glazing. Next is going to be salt, soap, alcohol, wet into wet, wax, wet into dry, and tape. And so these are a bunch of different techniques I'm going to show you so that you know how to use watercolor the way you want to create the effects that you would like. Okay, so basic tools that you have to have anytime you're doing watercolor: a cup of clean water. It's really important to stop when the water gets dirty, empty it out, and replace it with fresh water. Okay, you need to have your brush. These are Sumier Japanese calligraphy brushes, and you can see they hold a lot of water with their big chunky bristles, but they also can maintain a really fine point, which is the thing that we like about them. Some paper towels and some regular just printer paper to test our colors on. Okay, so the first wash we're going to do is going to be a single color wash. And what we're going to do is we are going to pick the piece of paper up, and we're going to hold it up at an angle so that the water is running down with gravity to make a little puddle towards the bottom of the paper. And so the next thing I'm going to do before I start is I'm going to take my watercolors and I'm going to mix up a puddle of the color that I'm using. And I need to have more water than I think I need and paint mixed together. So I'm getting water in here. I'm going to get my paint and I'm going to mix it in with it until I get the right color intensity. And so I mix a little bit of this in advance just for efficiency. Now, here's a really important step. You need to always test your color. So if I look at that and I go, okay, that's nice and vibrant. That's how I want maybe just a teeny bit more orange in there so that it really shows up. Okay. And so always test your watercolors before you put them on so that you make sure it's the color you want and that it's not too light. Okay, so I have my puddle of mixed paint and water for my wash. So I'm going to take my watercolor paper, and instead of having it flat, I'm going to hold it up at an angle. So the angle is not super steep, so I don't have to be really steep like that, but I'm going to hold it up facing me. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my brush so that the point of the brush that's loaded with paint is pointing down. And what I'm looking to do is create a little line of water puddling along that edge so that the color will be continuous. And so everyone I know struggles with doing even washes with watercolor because they leave it lying down flat and they go over and over it and they try and fix it. So if you're doing a wash, it's a really quick process. You make sure that your point of your brush is pointing downward, and I usually do a fist grip, so I'm holding the brush like that in my fist. And what I want to do is I want to maintain a leading edge that has a little puddle of water, but not so much that it drips. So I have to pay attention. The other thing I'm going to do is I have to be ready to do the entire wash without stopping. So I have my puddle of water, I have my brush. I'm going to just like get in the zen for a moment, and then I will start. Okay, so I have my paper towel nearby in case I need to blot it. So I'm going to dip in and I'm going to start my first one. Once I start, I'm going to try to just be as quick as possible and not talk because I want a really nice, smooth gradient. Okay, so I'm going to hold my brush and I'm gonna start. So see that puddle of water that sits at the bottom? So I'm gonna dip when I need to dip, and when it's a big puddle, I'm not gonna dip in again, right? So I have that, now I'm gonna dip and then go across, shake it off. I'm gonna go one more time because the puddle looks like it's about to drip. Now I'm gonna dip in again. And the faster I can do this, the less streaky my wash is gonna be. So as long as there's a puddle, I don't need to dip back in again. These brushes hold a lot of water. Now, see what that did right there? There's a fingerprint on this piece of paper. So like I said about not touching the edges too much, you wanna be really careful, okay? Because that's what happens. It makes an oil resist from the skin oils where it won't stay on. Now, there's my wash. So now I have this little puddle down at the bottom. I'm gonna take my brush and I'm going to soak some of the paint off and then use this like a little vacuum, just touching it to the edge of the paper. Now, one of the big mistakes people make all the time with washes is they miss a little area or they see a little mistake and they try and go back and fix it. And what that does is it's gonna make a splotchy area that will not look nice. Now you can see my paper's curled up. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to set it down and let it dry and flatten. Now, you can see right there, that's somebody's literal like fingerprint on my wash from their oily hands, okay? And so that's why we are careful to hold our paper only by the edges. So while I'm waiting for this, I'm gonna mix up my next color of wash, and I want to go from one color to another. So I'm gonna make sure that my paint is really gonna be really vibrant by adding a lot more paint to my water, okay? And I'm gonna test it on another piece of paper to see how it looks. Come over here. And I can see that's a lot more vibrant than this original one, so I like that. Now, I'm gonna come over here, in my water, I'm gonna rinse out my brush, and I should go change this water. But instead of changing it, because I want to show you guys the next thing real quick, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go with the same color family, so I'm going with an analogous color. I'm gonna do my second color for my gradient, red, so that I don't have to change my water, just strictly because I'm being lazy. Okay, so I'm gonna mix that up and see how I have like a nice little puddle of color. So I'm getting my brush into the paint and I'm just going back and forth between the paint, and I almost do like a wiping motion with the brush to get it to mix in. Okay, so once I feel like it's got nice color, I'm going to test it on my scratch paper to see if it's vibrant enough. And I think that that's good vibrancy, but I always do just a teeny bit more paint just in case. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with one color and then I'm gonna switch to the other. When I am doing a 2-color gradient, I always like to do the lighter color first. And so if we look at this, we have red, we have orange. Orange is definitely lighter. So I'm gonna rinse the red out of my brush. And after this wash, before I go on to anything else, it will definitely change my water. So I'm gonna rinse that out really well. I'm gonna pat my brush on my paper towel, and then I'm gonna do my next wash. Now, this has been enough time that if I put my knuckles on here, this paper feels just barely cool, which means it's dry-ish, that's what I'll say. Okay, so I'm gonna get over here into my paint. Oh, and I dried my brush, so that's ending up sucking up a lot of the water. So I'm gonna make sure I still have a puddle of paint. You always wanna have a nice little puddle. Okay, so I'm mixing my orange so I have enough, testing it, it's a good color. Now, I'm gonna do the same thing again. I'm gonna hold my paper up facing me. I'm gonna put my paints right here. And I'm going to start out with my orange. Now, the tricky part is you have to change really quick from one color to another. Okay, so I'm going to actually stop and wash my brush out for a minute. So that's better. You can see how much red was in there. I rinsed it out. I want my orange to be orange and not red orange. Okay. So here we go. I'm gonna start with our orange. Okay, so I have both my colors mixed and ready, because once I start painting, I can't stop, and I don't want to have to stop and mix paint, because if I do, it's gonna make a stripe. Now you can see how nice this gradient is, how smooth it is. That's because we had everything ready. We had the leading edge that was damp, and we used the technique that works really well. The only flaw is that little fingerprint right there. Okay, so I'm gonna come over here. I'm gonna hold my paper up at an angle, and it's about like maybe a 20-degree angle, and I'm gonna start with my orange. Okay, so I'm doing the same thing again. Here's my orange, and I'm not getting into that other side. And you can see I need to make sure I'm maintaining that puddle. So I'm gonna get about a third of the way down, and then I'm gonna switch. Now before I switch, I'm gonna take my brush real quick and just pat, pat, pat to pull some of the paint out. Now I'm going right into the red, and I don't wanna mess around because I want it to be a good transition. And didn't mix enough paint, so I'm gonna go real quick into my red, because I have to keep that leading edge wet if I want there to be no stripes. Okay, so see I have a little flick there. I'm not gonna try and fix it. I'm just gonna quickly keep going, and it also looks like I'm really close to getting a drip, so I'm just gonna keep going very carefully, not dipping back into my puddle, because I already have too much paint on here and I want to control it. Okay, so that's the end of my wash. Okay, so same thing as last time. I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to blot some of the water out, and I'm going to use it just touching the edge of the paper to vacuum a little bit of the paint off. So I'm not touching my brush to the top of the paper. I'm just holding it along the bottom edge, and I'm using gravity to help me, so that I don't have a little weird puddle of color, because if I left that puddle on there and I sat this down flat, it would fade back into the bottom and do like this little weird effect that we don't want, because we just want a smooth gradient. So I'm going to keep doing that, just touching the bottom, letting the brush vacuum all the water right back off the paper. Okay, and then that's it. I'm gonna let those dry. So you can see that you need to have quite a bit more paint mix than you think you need, just so that you don't have to stop in the middle. So I'm gonna let this dry before I can work on the back side. And after that's had some time to dry, then we'll go on to resist in the next part of the process.